Now, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Megan Best, our first keynote speaker. Megan is online, so let me introduce her a little bit. How might Christians respond to the increasing challenges raised by technological advances in human life and death issues? Today, we are going to hear from an expert on the subject. Megan Best is a palliative care doctor, researcher and bioethicist. She's currently Associate Professor of Bioethics at the Institute for Ethics and Society at the University of Notre in Sydney. And she's an Honorary Associate Professor at the University of Sydney Medical School. She has over 30 years of experience in palliative care, medical ethics teaching, research and practice. And throughout her career, she is engaged with health policy development, contributing to palliative care strategy and health legislation. She's the author of 2 books on ethics at the beginning of life. One is called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, and another, A Life Already Started. She's also the author of many articles on ethics and spiritual care at the end of life. In October 2022, Megan founded Australia's new Ethicentre in order to provide people with reliable information about Christian bioethics within a biblical framework. So today, Megan will introduce the Ethicentre and the ethical challenges facing Christians in Australia. Will you please welcome Associate Professor Megan Best.
Chris, thank you so much for inviting me to speak this morning, and good morning, everyone. It's great that we have this opportunity to discuss such an important topic. And I'm very sorry I can't be there in person due to another speaking engagement later in the day in another city. But what I'd like to do is to just help you understand some of the challenges that are arising in modern bioethics in the way that modern healthcare is developing. I think it's true to say that Christians have always looked to the Bible to understand how we should live. But over the last couple of decades, I've received an increasing number of emails, lots of them, from Christians who are struggling to work out what to do when faced with an ethical decision in their own healthcare. Strangers who found my email online. And they're questions like, what should I do with the frozen embryos left over from my IVF treatment? Or my father's dying. Is it ethically permissible to turn off his ventilator? My unborn baby has a genetic defect and we've been advised to have an abortion. What should we do? These are people who are trying to live out lives of Christian integrity, but they don't know where to turn to get the guidance they need. Christians have been called to live obedient lives, and we're told to obey God's commands as an expression of our love for Christ. God's commands exist to help us flourish as human beings, as we've just seen. But when it comes to bioethics, this seems to be an increasing challenge for Christians to know what the biblical instruction is. So just to make sure we're on the same page, bioethics is concerned with how to decide right from wrong when it comes to the biological sciences. And I'm aware that many people in the audience won't be biological scientists. So here are a few of the hot topics that are current in bioethics, just to help you get into my space. You can see fairly quickly that bioethics is often in the news and often a topic of controversy. So how are we going when it comes to bioethics in the church? Well, you don't have to look far to see that the Christian community is not all that different from the general public when it comes to bioethical views. During the recent local euthanasia debate, polls showed that 3/4 of all Catholics and 4 in 5 Anglicans in Australia supported legalisation of euthanasia. And according to the Guttmacher Institute in the USA, 2/3 of women in the United States who have abortions identify themselves as Christian. Now, we don't keep the local stats, but we do know that 1 in 3 Australian women will have an abortion. So chances are there's someone in your local congregation who's had personal experience of it. Now, while I have problems with how some of these polls are conducted, you get the drift. There appears to be a lack of understanding or a lack of commitment to biblical teaching in this area. This is a paper we published in the Journal of Religion and Health last year from a study we did in the Anglican Church. One interesting point is that we asked for Christian respondents who had personally spent time with a transgender person at their church to respond, and we got 277 responses, but we had to exclude 155 of them, over half, mainly because respondents confused transgender with homosexual. It's a pretty basic mistake. Well, why is this? Well, I think there are several factors working together that makes bioethics a difficult space for Christians to navigate. They include false beliefs in modern healthcare, lack of teaching in our churches, and hostility in the surrounding culture. So I'll go through these now. In order to understand some of the fundamental challenges, I think we need to understand some of these false assumptions that underlie modern secular healthcare. The first is that humans are just biological machines. Humans have always tried to understand what it is to be human, channel the best science technology of the age. So the ancients thought that the world was created by fire and wind and water and earth, and they thought the human body was created out of the same. Since the age of industrialization, we've tended to think of human beings as basically machines, and I quote Richard Dawkins, "We're all machines built by DNA whose purpose is to make more copies of the same DNA. It's every living object's sole reason for living." Behind this attitude is the worldview called scientific materialism, the belief that reality consists of nothing but physical reality and the scientific laws which govern their interaction. Now, of course, in many ways, the understanding of the body as a machine has been extremely successful. It's led to many advances in healthcare. For example, the technology used in intensive care units uses machine concepts to understand how to manipulate the physiology of blood circulation and gas exchange. This is very effective in supporting very sick patients. So it's not all that bad, not all bad. But once you take this idea of machine as the dominant understanding of what it means to be human, then things start to go wrong. This way of thinking is like playing with Lego, which my grandson loves to do. And the thing about Lego is that you can basically make whatever you want. Lego has no fundamental order. The only limitation is your imagination, and I think Lego Masters has shown us that. And so you take the bricks and you put them together in lots of different ways. And modern biotechnology is often using the same kind of idea. We can take our understanding of the way that the machine works, and we can put the bits together in any way we like. There is no fundamental order or design behind the human body. And of course, this is all linked to the idea of Darwinian evolution, that evolution is a random process which has been going on for millions of years. This is a story where there is no creator God in the equation. And the particular structure of our human bodies is just an accident of evolutionary history. So that means if we want to change the design, if we want to take control over the evolutionary process, there's absolutely no reason why we should not do so. Genetic engineering, here we come. And while in the traditional biblical thinking, human beings and animals are quite distinct, if we're an accident of evolution, such a distinction no longer applies. The biblical view is that human beings are unique in reflecting God's image in the cosmos. Then there are non-human animals who are our close relatives, but who are different from us. But what's happening in the modern world is that the boundaries between these different concepts are blurring. So what's the difference between a human being and an animal? Well, you know, we're all primates. We've all got the same kind of DNA. In fact, chimpanzee DNA is more than 98% identical with human. So really, there's no difference between a human and an animal, according to this view. What then happens is that the unique identity of what it means to be human is being lost, and what were previously ethical boundaries in science are being ignored. For example, if there's no difference between humans and animals, we can create human-animal chimeras. But what's the moral status of an embryo that has been created with both human and animal cells? Is it equivalent to a human or an animal? Or neither? These are new dilemmas for Christian thinkers. A second false assumption is that in modern healthcare is that technology can solve all our problems. For millions of years, we've lived with the human condition, the fact that we're frail, dependent, and that we have all kinds of limitations which are due to our biology. In the past, you just had to accept problems like infertility, the unwanted baby, disability, and incurable genetic diseases. What's new is the idea that technology gives us the dream of overcoming these fundamental problems in our humanity. So we no longer need to accept these conditions as givens. No, we have the technology. We can change this. And this leads on to a sort of techno-optimism, which is rife in the modern age. The belief is that we're going to use technology to solve all the problems of humanity. So when the sequencing of the human genome was announced, it was amazing to see the worldwide global coverage of this scientific event, which at times took on a religious tone. So you've got the Times reporting that this was a new beginning in which we finally accept that we are our own creators and that we alone have the power to make a better world. And so the technology advances and it has astonishing potential. For instance, for people with paralysis, there's now the possibility of using high-tech brain implants to allow them to control their limbs by using machinery and information technology, controlled entirely by thought alone. And you can see how this kind of technology has enormous potential for helping people with severe disabilities. But at the same time, of course, godlike powers without a moral foundation can be put to use as other than the common good. Exactly the same technology is being developed by military organizations around the world in order to make soldiers smarter and more destructive than those on the other side. So this kind of technology has a dark face as well. And the bigger investor in using technology to make humans faster and stronger and smarter is, you guessed it, the US military. The US military and their specialist research unit called DARPA has a budget of over $4 billion next year to invest in human advancement in order to make sure that their soldiers are the smartest, the fittest, and the most destructive in the world. And of course, if human beings are merely machines, then the strong can exploit the weak. And as we speak, human organs are being conveyed across the world for use in transplants. Trafficked organs, which by and large are passing from poor people to rich people. They're passing from weak people and children to rich and elderly people in the Western world. And so the age-old power structures are being reinforced by this modern medical technology. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the words of C.S. Lewis, writing at the end of the Second World War. Man's power over nature turns out to be power exerted by some men over other men. So whenever we hear about human beings exerting power over nature, you need to think again, how is this power being used? And so often, it is powered by the rich and the strong, using technological power to manipulate and abuse those who are weak and vulnerable. But Christian thinking reverses the power structures completely, and it's the weak and vulnerable, widows and orphans and aliens, who become those who our God are most concerned to defend and protect. Another striking development in medical care has been the rise of consumerism, where everyone has the right to make their own rules and choose their own lifestyle. And it's important to understand that consumerism is basically a spiritual issue. It's about the religion of self. I become the God of my own universe. There's now a lot of pressure on healthcare providers to change in response to consumer pressures. When I started out in medicine, we used to think in terms of patients, and we used to think about doctors as carers. But now the language of consumerism has affected healthcare. So some organisation calls their patients clients or healthcare consumers, and we are healthcare providers. And really, what the idea is, from a consumer's point of view, is that you are the healthcare professional and you have the responsibility to meet my needs. It's the responsibility of the medical profession to provide whatever I want. So healthcare turns into a modern service industry, and an enormous amount of emphasis in healthcare is placed on the patient experience and how we can make the patient more satisfied. This is undergirded by an elevation of the importance of the principle of patient autonomy. The principle of autonomy says that I am king of my own realm. English Enlightenment philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote, over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. He or she has the right to decide what happens to their own body. In modern secular medical ethics, many people have argued that this principle of autonomy is the overriding principle in all ethics, trumping all other values. Again, it hasn't been all bad. Increased respect for autonomy has led to many good things, like, for instance, informed consent, where the old system of doctor knows best or paternalism has been restrained. But now the tables have turned completely, and in this way of thinking, it's the customer who's king. It's the customer who pays, it's the customer who decides, and our job as professionals is to make sure that we meet patient needs. It's worth thinking about how this kind of force changes the nature of healthcare. The patient wants antibiotics, not the doctor's spiel on how they don't work for a viral infection. So it will be interesting to see what happens now that pharmacists, people with great faith in drugs, are being given the right to prescribe. Resistance to antibiotics is already a problem threatening our welfare. Autonomy has led to the reimagining of what constitutes healthcare. If there's no meaning in life, there's no meaning in death. And with a lack of understanding of the purpose of suffering, the population is understandably less willing to tolerate it. So we have legalization of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, so that rather than tolerate becoming dependent on others, we can avoid the dying process completely by checking out 6 or 12 months in advance. Of course, it's better if the doctor does the deed. So we label killing our patients as a form of healthcare, voluntary assisted dying, with a Medicare rebate attached. Doctors who prefer not to kill their patients are now the ones who have no compassion, according to this view. It's interesting, in the old way of thinking about medicine, the doctor committed herself to act in the best interests of the patient. It's the whole idea behind the Hippocratic Oath. But this is now increasingly replaced by a contract, and that changes the nature of the relationship. It becomes something much more mechanical, much more legally oriented, and sometimes there's more conflict. Because once we think in terms of rights and duties, there's often a conflict between what the patient wants and what the doctors want to provide. And associated with this, we are now seeing the influence of ideology into the practice of healthcare. It seems incredible, but medicine is abandoning biological facts in some areas. For example, transgender activists influenced the writing of the latest version of the American Psychiatric Association, DSM, the Bible of Psychiatric Diagnoses. The previous version listed incongruence of physical sex and self-perception of gender, that is, thinking you're in the wrong body, as a psychiatric disorder. But in the latest version, this mismatch is not pathological in itself. It's only if there is distress associated as an experience of this incongruence, and it's now called gender dysphoria. This change was made in response to ideological factors and the desire to destigmatize gender incongruence. It wasn't a response to scientific research. Laws in 3 states now forbid doctors from providing any counselling which does not affirm the belief that, in fact, patients with gender incongruity are correct in their perception. This advice goes against available empirical evidence regarding the most effective treatment of gender incongruence. And of course, if we're not allowed to discuss alternative treatments, we certainly can't do any further research comparing outcomes. Along with an erosion of moral truth, we're seeing an erosion of factual truth. I know I'm giving just a bird's eye view, and there's a lot more I could say on the abandonment of factual truth in medicine, but let's move on. Finally, medical ethics have become difficult because of pluralism. And as we know, in modern societies, we have many competing ideas of what is right and what is wrong. And a lot of the debates that go on in medical ethics are because there's no agreement about what makes something right or wrong, or indeed about how we would go about deciding what is right or wrong. This is because we have a range of worldviews represented in society, and our worldview determines what it is that we hold to be of value. And if you think about a Christian patient with a non-Christian doctor, you can understand why conflicts would occur. And this brings us to the popularity of moral relativism, that there is no ultimate truth or falsehood. There is no ultimate right or wrong, that it's simply a cultural thing, that the truth and falsity of moral judgments is not absolute, but relative to the traditions, the convictions, the practices of a group of persons. So one community might say, well, this is fine, our behaviour is absolutely fine and normal. Another group of people from a different culture may say, no, that's absolutely terrible and evil. We must punish people who behave like that. So your female circumcision is my genital mutilation. How can we choose between the different cultures? Well, the easy way out is by saying, well, there's no right or wrong. I just want to point out that these different trends in modern society and in modern healthcare can combine together in a very potent and potentially dangerous way. So for instance, consumerism says, I want this. Moral relativism says, well, why not? And then along comes technology that says, well, we can make it happen, but it will cost you. And the cost of technology so often is more than just the economic cost. There are also personal and spiritual costs. So for instance, take reproductive technology. Here I am, maybe a single infertile woman, or I could be a single man, but I desperately want to have a child. I want my own child. My lifestyle is not complete without my child, my own child. So I want to find an egg donor. I want to find a surrogate mother. And I want to use technology to be able to create my own child, the child of my own desire. And because I want the child to be perfect, I want to use genetic screening and embryo selection to make sure that the child meets my specifications. So consumerism says, that's what I want. I want that kind of child. Moral relativism says, well, what's wrong with it? Provided the child is going to be loved, who are we to say that this woman cannot have her own child? And you know what? We don't have any right to say what's right or wrong. So moral relativism says, why not? And technology says, well, we can set it up for you. We can set up a website. We can choose sperm donors and egg donors. We have a technique for implanting embryos and surrogate mothers. We'll use embryo screening. We could give you what we want and we can make it happen. So these different trends are all meeting together in the world of modern secular healthcare and leading to some very powerful but potentially dangerous and challenging developments, which can lead to morally questionable healthcare options, which will be offered to Christians. So how will Christians learn how to navigate modern healthcare? Well, this is some market research that we did for Ethicentre. It's a cohort of fairly well-educated Christians who mainly rely on media and the internet to source information on bioethics. And a significant number didn't know where to go to get bioethical information. The mainstream media doesn't help. I don't know if anyone saw this. It was the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald recently. And the article, which reported the views of LGBTQI advocates, implied that human beings have more than two sexes, more than two biological sexes, and it confused the categories of biological sex, sexual attraction, and gender identity. How will the average Christian unpack this? Well, we usually learn how to live as Christians by being taught from the pulpit. But there's evidence that teaching on ethics in our churches is lagging. And there are several reasons for this. Our ministers are struggling, and you really have to sympathise. Oh, too far. First of all, it can be quite difficult for non-experts to understand the subject area. Areas of science, such as genetics, are developing rapidly, so you can't rely on your high school science knowledge to help you understand the content. It can be hard to stay informed even if you're in the trade, and often the theological work hasn't been done because these things are new. So your average minister doesn't know what to teach. It can also be difficult to teach Christian bioethics because many new technologies, which may be ethically troubling for Christians, are actually seeking goods that we seek for ourselves. Things like a healthy child of one's own, freedom from suffering. These are good things. It's okay to want these things. It's not the goal of the technology that's wrong. It's the means that are being used to achieve it. And furthermore, bioethics has always been a sensitive topic to discuss. These are issues which touch on real lives, often in painful ways. And many people in our churches have been hurt by the judgmental attitudes in the church of the past. Discussion of bioethics requires gentleness and sensitivity. But even when we think we are doing so, we can still have problems. And this is because of our current political climate. The surrounding non-Christian culture tends to be hostile to Christian moral values, and we can be criticised or fired for expressing traditional Christian views on topics such as sex or abortion. And this can make Christians shrink from these discussions. When we have a public debate with the woke movement, If you don't agree with someone, it can be interpreted as hate speech. Add to this the overwhelming presence of social media in our lives, hitting back at any profession of faith. And anyone who teaches biblical ethics is likely to be criticised by unbelievers and perhaps believers as well. For example, some of you might have known how virulent the reaction has been to the reversal of the Roe versus Wade case in the USA. And this can be very confusing. If you're not well taught, it can be very difficult to understand what's going on. I personally receive hate mail from both sides of the debate. So all these factors are combining to reduce teaching of bioethics in our churches. But we're called to live lives of personal holiness that will be distinctly different from those in the secular culture. As Romans 12 tells us, we're not to be conformed to this world, but rather transformed by the renewal of our minds, that by testing we may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So after 30 years in the business of teaching Christian ethics, I'm involved with a group establishing Ethicentre. Ethicentre is a new Christian non-profit organisation that we hope will become the go-to hub for Australian Christians looking for bioethical information. We aim to provide reliable information about matters of Christian ethics within a biblical framework. So how does it help Christians to be informed about these things? Well, if we work from the premise that the purpose of Christian teaching is nothing less than to see the complete conformity of every child of God to the perfect image of Christ the Son, there are going to be several ways in which knowledge about Christian bioethics is going to have an impact. At an individual level, we need to understand a biblical approach to medical issues to inform our own views and decision-making. And it helps to think through bioethical issues before they impact our lives. Decisions based on quiet reflection before it's clouded by emotion. And I know that when I was diagnosed with a virus in my second pregnancy, which potentially would have caused birth defects in our child, my husband and I were glad that we'd already thought through the question of whether we would contemplate abortion. And we had lots of things we were concerned about, but at least we didn't have to be concerned about that. And she's doing well. At an interrelational level, our understanding of bioethics can be needed when others ask our advice on an issue of pastoral care, but it will also lend an evangelistic edge to our discussions with non-Christians. I can remember a couple I walked alongside where the woman found that the child she was carrying late in pregnancy had a problem that wasn't compatible with life outside the womb. But as she got to be the couple decided that they would not have an abortion, that they would care for their child as long as they could. So they planned to carry that child to term. And as she got very pregnant, she found more and more people were coming up to her saying, "Oh, you must be so excited, you know, baby's going to be born." And the couple had 3 other children, and they were very much engaged in the school community. So they realized they were going to have to tell people that the baby was going to die at the time of birth and to explain the situation. I remember, I'll never forget the funeral, because the husband was a carpenter and he made the coffin for the baby and carried it into the church. The church was completely packed with people from that school community, and the subsequent service was an amazing testimony to the importance of every human life in the eyes of our God. Furthermore, if we truly believe we were made by a creator God, it's a service to our community to let them know that how we can flourish as human beings by giving them the guidelines which come from the one who created us. Jesus calls us to be salt and light in our community, salt to delay decaying of values in our society, light to illuminate the truth by living out kingdom values and bringing glory to the Father in heaven. This is what motivates me to become involved in advocacy for vulnerable groups. Now, this is a study we did in collaboration with the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity in Chicago. It was published in the Journal of Human Reproduction. And it's an international survey of over 1,500 Christians asking about their attitudes to assisted reproduction. ART is assisted reproductive technology. It's not paintings on the wall. Now, one interesting point that came out of this was that while most participants would want to make personal choices consistent with their faith, there was no sense that a similar approach would be of benefit to the wider community. No sense that our Creator God would have advice that would benefit the common good. I know from speaking in churches that there's a great reluctance for Christians to speak out in the public square. And in the recent euthanasia debate, there was very pointed criticism of church members who were speaking out against the law. I recently heard an American theologian asking, but wouldn't we expect Christians to be a little bit more political at the moment? Look at the culture around us. Society is changing. Basic creation order norms are being overturned. We're not debating taxes. We're discussing what makes a man and what makes a woman and who gets to live. And so necessarily you're going to expect Christians to address those issues. We can criticize how some people do it. I certainly wouldn't endorse how all Christians talk about bioethics. But the idea that these topics should not be discussed by Christians and not discussed in the church because they're controversial or is going to get you into trouble is evidence of an undeveloped theology, a theology of order. All politics is a reflection on order, and if we believe order is given to us by a creator God, we're necessarily going to want that order reflected in our common lives together. We're seeking to figure out how to live our life together in ways that seek the common good, that all would flourish. We don't seek public engagement to dominate. It's because we genuinely want to see people thrive. And that thriving is a reflection of that theological order that we think really exists. And this may or may not surprise you, but in all the years I've spoken in Christian bioethics, I've always found secular empirical research that supports the biblical view. So don't get sucked into thinking there's a neutral secular view. I'd like to suggest that the notion of secular neutrality is a myth. We regularly hear that people reporting the so-called factual view of problems in society, by which they suggest they're free from any religious or philosophic inference. But herein lies the problem. Such neutrality is impossible. Secularists have no claim to neutrality because, as is the case for any person, regardless of their religion or philosophical position, no one comes to the public square naked. Everyone comes with their presuppositions which guide their ethical analyses. It's through one's presuppositions that all facts are interpreted and to which, therefore, all decisions are related. No one works with a blank mind where facts are left uninterpreted. And while it's true that our Christian views will inform our opinions, that doesn't mean our opinions are wrong. And whatever our views, we all have a right to be heard in a democracy. Attempting to pretend that there is such a thing as a purely objective view of healthcare, devoid of personal values, is at best naive. We are all of us biased. However, the assumption that we can be truly neutral is still widespread. I'm concerned that many Christians still believe the myth of secular neutrality and are not sufficiently discerning in where they get their information and what they accept as gospel truth. We need to understand the facts, both regarding the issue themselves and the relevant biblical passages. We need to understand what is a Christian position so we can challenge current secular ideology, so we can defend ourselves on social media, so we can identify and cope with alternate views. We need the words required to speak the truth in love with gentleness and respect. We need vocabulary so that when bioethics hits the front page of the newspaper, we can articulate our views at the school gate, answer our children's questions, pray for our society in an informed way, and help people see the way to human flourishing. Sometimes it can be hard to love that person who opposes you and just gets under your skin. We need to learn how to engage with opposing views and find areas of agreement from which we can hopefully build some dialogue. And so we have introduced Ethicentre. Ethicentre is a registered charity with the Australian government, which was launched last month. We've developed a website, ethicentre.com. And in this audience, there may be many of you interested in engaging in bioethics, maybe joining in our discussions, maybe even writing for us. We'd love to hear from you as we seek to build the next generation of Christian bioethicists. Ethicentre has been built to serve you in the wider Christian community. God has given us the guidance we need to flourish as human beings. We need to take hold of it. We hope that it will also have a positive impact on our society as a whole. We would appreciate your prayers as we start out on this voyage, and we want to cater for both individuals and churches, so it would be wonderful if you could take the time to let us know how we can help you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. That's been a whirlwind tour of the issues that the issues of bioethics, the issues of working as Christians in an increasingly secular society, a society that doesn't recognise Christian foundations. We were hoping to have time for questions, but we don't have time for questions in fairness to the next presenters. And Megan, we wish you, forgive me, the very best for the Ethicentre. Thank you, everyone.